clip summarizing our efforts in conservation during Mazingira Day. And you will also be given a barcode for the full video. So we just clipped it for you. Please play the video. Any day now.
Hey everyone! Happy Mazingira Day and hello from Karura Forest. Did you know that Karura Forest is one of Africa's largest urban forests? And we are here today at the ALN Academy to show you how it's a powerful reflection of conservation in our country. So did you know that Karura Forest covers over 1,000 hectares of land? That's a lot of green space. And it's not just about nature. Karura Forest also serves as a carbon sink, keeping Nairobi's air clean and the city cool.
This is Indigenous Tree Nursery, an initiative to regenerate the dry upland forest. Over here, you're going to find 100,000 indigenous seedlings from over 70 different species.
Kwa hivyo, mimi nitaomba na Mazingira Day watu wachukulie ni kama siku ya kufurahia kutengeneza mazingira.
Hey everyone! Happy Mazingira Day and hello from Karura Forest. Did you know that Karura Forest is one of Africa's largest urban forests? And we are here today at the ALN Academy to show you how it's a powerful reflection of conservation in our country. So did you know that Karura Forest covers over 1,000 hectares of land? That's a lot of green space. And it's not just about nature. Karura Forest also serves as a carbon sink, keeping Nairobi's air clean and the city cool.
This is Indigenous Tree Nursery, an initiative to regenerate the dry upland forest. Over here, you're going to find 100,000 indigenous seedlings from over 70 different species.
Kwa hivyo, mimi nitaomba na Mazingira Day watu wachukulie ni kama siku ya kufurahia kutengeneza mazingira.
We're very committed to conservation efforts, as you can all clearly see. All right, as you may have guessed from the video, twice over, one of our focus areas at the Academy is Africa, ESG, and the green economy. We also focus on 4 other pillars, which include gender, intra-African trade, youth and migration, as well as peace and democracy. Through our 5 pillars, we are dedicated to advancing the rule of law across Africa, strengthening governance, building legal capacity, and leading powerful conversations that inspire innovative ideas and enduring impact. So, because of our powerful conversations, we have an esteemed panel today, which includes Chris Diaz, who is the Executive Chairman of Adili Group and Director of Growth and New Markets at ALN Kenya and ALN Tanzania, and he has over 33 years of experience in brand building and growth strategy. He's committed to fostering sustainable business practices and youth empowerment. Welcome, Chris. You may come up. And then Wangui Kaniaru is a partner at ALN Kenya, Anjarwalla and Khanna, specializing in corporate law. She advises on commercial transactions, including joint ventures and acquisitions across jurisdictions. An advocate of the High Court of Kenya and a member of the New York State Bar, Wangui offers critical insights into corporate governance and compliance in the context of African trade, making her a valuable voice in our webinar today. Wangui, welcome. Up next, we have Jesse Zygmunt, who is the General Counsel and Director of Risk, Compliance and Audit at Mkopa, a leading connected asset financing company in Africa. He oversees corporate, commercial, regulatory, data privacy and governance matters. His prior role at UK Financial Conduct Authority further enhances his expertise, making him a valuable participant in our webinar today. Welcome, Jesse. And finally, we have Andile Malinga. Andile Malinga is a senior business developer at Tre Altamira, a collect localization satellite company in Southern Africa. His work focuses on INSAR applications in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in the mining sector. He's a registered geologist with the Geological Society of South Africa. Andile is dedicated to using space solutions for the sustainable management of earthly resources. Welcome, Andile. And leading and moderating this discussion is our very own Aisha Abdallah, the director of ALN Academy and a talented litigator at Anjarwalla in Khanna. Aisha leads initiatives that empower legal professionals, ensuring that they're equipped to navigate the evolving landscape of African trade and governance. Aisha's expertise and commitment to legal excellence position her as a key figure in fostering collaboration among stakeholders during our webinar on the intersection of ESG, trade, and digitalization under the AfCFTA. Aisha, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Just to warn everyone that when I start picking on people for questions, I always start from the back, and so you are invited to take up the seats towards the front, unless you wish to be spotlighted. So welcome to my panelists, and we'll dive straight in. The way we'll run this panel is starting from a global perspective. We'll look at different regions of the world and what they're doing around these topics. And then we'll probably drill down to some specific issues around for Africa challenges that we face, opportunities in terms of governance and frameworks, and then particular industry sectors. So starting off, I'll start off with you, Chris. You were recently at the UN General Assembly, where you interacted with people from around the world. Perhaps you can make the link for us. How does ESG relate to the UN Global Compact and the Sustainable Development Goals? And in particular, how would we measure the impact of any of these interventions?
Thank you very much, Aisha. It's wonderful to have a session, and I see so many women leaders in the room, so already that gives us a strong percentage of gender balance. Thank you and most welcome. The United Nations is playing a very big partnership with private sector and governments across the world, and it is extremely important that the private sector and Adili Group is also a member of the UN Global Compact, continues to deliver on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN is engaging global leaders to cascade, to deliver, to promote, and then to measure regularly so that they are able to show success on the ESG ratings. So the 17 global goals, you'll find that ESG is integrated, especially one on the environment. You can see the SDG number 13, which is focusing on climate actions. It's also where the private sector have come from, manufacturing background, aviation background, where organizations have to commit and measure on a regular basis how much decarbonization they are achieving. This is very important for net zero. The other one is Sustainable Development Goal number 5 is for women leadership. And you can see that also strongly from Adili Group, which I represent, over 60% of our teams, and we are very proud of this, are women leaders. So we continue to do this as private sector across the world. Then the other sustainable development goal, Aisha, is number 16, which is on governance, which focuses and ensures that we are all the time looking at fairness, peace, justice, and security around our businesses, and also supporting the United Nations global objectives. When it comes to the second question Aisha is asking with reference to measures, the ESG are ratings, and you'll find all the leadership, especially at board level, create ESG board committees that make recommendations of their quarterly and annual progressive metrics. So for example, like I gave you an example, what is the contribution of gender diversity in your organization out of 100? So as we work towards scientific initiatives and metrics with the UN and other international bodies, it is very, very important the legal frameworks and the ratings are well accepted globally, because when a private sector organization needs international financing or to attract investors, the ESG ratings play a good role to show the company is compliant and also a progressive organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for setting us off with this global compact and the context, and also linking it to things that are very important to us in Africa, because I think there may be a perception that ESG is primarily a corporate issue and doesn't actually affect people on the ground, but you've explained why actually there's a real link between the commitment and standards and improving the situation of people in Africa and meeting our sustainable development goals. So turning to you, Jesse, I'd like to invite you to tell us about MCOPA's journey and what you are doing in terms of ESG standards.
Thanks, Aisha. And it's great to see so many bright young minds here in the room, the next generation of leaders, so thank you. I'll talk a little bit about MCOPA. I'll start a little bit with the opportunities and the ways that we've incorporated ESG into our business model, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges as well a little bit later on in the program. MCOPA is one of the leaders in providing life-changing products and services to what we call the everyday earner. So those are typically non-salaried people, sometimes referred to as people in the gig economy, or in Kenya especially the hustler economy, which is often termed. I think MCOPA has proven itself to be a business that really can marry a lot of the principles that Chris just mentioned and others relating to ESG into our business model, and has demonstrated that you can have a for-profit company that's actually achieving some of the impact that the SDGs, but also some of the ESG principles are set out to be. We're really focused on digital inclusion, financial inclusion. So I'll give a good example. We've unlocked $1.5 billion worth of credit to the digitally and financially excluded. So these are people that don't have formal credit histories, that are unable to tap financing in everyday financing markets. Like I said, we've been able to provide a lot of credit to these people. We're one of the largest smartphone financing companies in Africa. We actually assemble 5,000 smartphones a day off Mombasa Road. So just the impact story there of creating 300 to 400 jobs of highly skilled, trained workers. But kind of more important to that is we're providing smartphones to people who are getting online for the first time. So half of our customers are getting connected to the internet for the first time via a phone, via the MCOPA smartphone, because we're financing that for them. 2/3 of our customers are reporting that we're increasing the income of their day-to-day earnings by using smartphones as well. For them, smartphones are not just a way to surf the internet and browse Facebook, it's also a way for them to make a living. Maybe that's by going on an app and making a living, or maybe that's by doing marketing. So just naturally through our business model, we're increasing the livelihoods of our people. Chris was speaking about women. This is another beautiful example. Women are actually our best paying customers. So 40% of our customers right now are women. We have a target actually to get to 50%, which really is great for digital and financial inclusion, but it's also great business as well. Another thing to highlight is women are also our best sales agents. We have 30,000 sales agents across the 5 markets that we operate in. women are our best sales agents, and so we also have a target to try to increase the number of women sales agents. So it is a really good example, I think, at MCOPA of how you can marry business, ESG, and SDG principles all in one. It's not perfect. There's still some opportunities and challenges to work on, again, which I'll talk about. But I do think it's a great example to show how ESG can be embedded into core commercial principles in order to drive profit, but also in order to drive impact in the markets that we're operating in.
Thank you, Jesse. I have to agree with you. Women are fantastic credit risk. So, MCOPA is a UK PLC, and yet your core market is Kenya. You're also operating in 4 other countries in Africa. What are some of the opportunities and challenges you face in implementing ESG standards across all your different markets?
Thanks. Yeah. So I guess I just spoke about the benefits and the opportunities. I'll speak about some of the challenges as well. You know, we are a UK parent company, but as Aisha said, we're operating in primarily African markets, Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. A lot of the money that we do raise, though, does come from the global north, right? So that might be Europe, that might be the United States. You know, I think some of the problems that we do deal with, or some of the challenges, is a lot of the ESG frameworks that come are a very one-size-fits-all framework, right? So a lot of the standards that we have to comply with do originate mostly from Europe and other markets. There's a fragmentation of standards in Africa at the moment, and also a dearth of standards. There isn't a lot of standards, so we're not really leading from the front. You know, so for a company like MCOPA, we have very high compliance costs when it comes to ESG, right? So when we take money from investors, that comes with a variety of requirements of things that we need to do. Now, a lot of those things make a lot of sense. So when we're thinking about, you know, the S of ESG, we're thinking about how do we treat our employees fairly, making sure that we're focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, gender representation, grievances, ensuring we have strong whistleblowing protections, how are we interacting with the community, et cetera. So a lot of this stuff makes business sense and stuff that we're doing anyway. A lot of the other stuff is a stretch, I would say. You know, there's a large focus on our supply chain, for example. We are very much responsible for having to diligence our third-party partners. Now, that makes sense to a degree, but, you know, one of our investors recently was trying to get us to audit, you know, dozens of third parties in a year. And we said, guys, it doesn't make sense to do that. Like, we can't do that. We'd be spending all of our time auditing. And can you imagine if every company had to audit every other company in the world, all we'd be doing is going around and auditing each other. So there really is not a one-size-fits-all model that should be applied to Africa. I think there's, you know, for a company like ourselves, which is, you know, relatively well-funded and is a bigger company and is a later stage company, the compliance costs for us are quite substantial. I can only imagine what it is for an earlier stage company, for a smaller SME. So I think we do need to right-size some of this stuff. I think the last thing I'd say is some of the directives that are coming out of Europe as well, I think are quite difficult to manage. 2 recently are the CSDDD and the CSRD, which are really supply chain reporting and due diligence standards. So for companies, for example, that are importing into Europe, they really now need to diligence their entire supply chain, which is raising compliance costs for European companies that are sourcing from Africa, but that are also really raising the compliance costs for African companies that want to tap the European market, for example. And so these are just kind of 2 small examples of the quite large compliance costs that I think do need to be right-sized and made fit for purpose for African entities, especially going forward.
Thank you. And that brings us nicely back to Chris, because one of the points you've raised, Jesse, is the fact that Africa isn't leading the conversations at the moment on ESG, even though to a large extent we are adversely impacted by many of these issues. So, Chris, can you tell us how ESG aligns with the African Free Continental Trade Agreement? I know you're a big supporter of this treaty. Maybe you can also explain why is it important for us in Africa that we support it?
Thank you very much, Jesse. Excellent points, and it's wonderful to have such a brilliant panel, and I'm sure all their views will add so much value to the discussions. The Africa Continental Trade Agreement remains one of the most powerful opportunities for international trade, and also to give the great talent and the leadership in Africa to take a bigger role in revenue generation, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of increase in employment. The African Continental Trade Agreement, Aisha, today has a market, which you well know, of nearly 1.5 billion people. The Africa Continental Trade Agreement is the largest free trade zone in the world. The intra-Africa statistics shows from the reports that we are trading within each other, the Africa nations, at 6 to 7%, while in the Europe and the Asia markets, they trade in double digits between 40 to 60%. So in terms of opportunities and value addition, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of training, in terms of leadership, in terms of young leaders growing into bigger opportunities and becoming great entrepreneurs, this is the most exciting time. Africa is the future. They need all great business leaders, lawyers, they need great tax people, they need great commercial people. So the connection between the Africa Continental Trade Agreement is a lot of trade, international trade, the digitization, the transformation of digitization across Africa. All the economies are going to go full digital, just like you're seeing in Kenya, where you're e-citizen, you can pay on time, error-free, and get the service immediately, but also the government can collect the revenues efficiently, which also reduces costs, and then we can have seamless movements of custom collections of taxes. So all this international trade in terms of commitment to ensure that we have good governance, we have integrity, we have good human resource talent development, we have good labor practices, we are fair, and we are just in the integration, regional integration of our business in Africa. Now, Africa is the great next best place in terms of governance because majority of the leadership in Africa are young people. So they will, as Jesse has just said, the future is in your hands to build greater leadership. So in terms of governance, in terms of leadership, in terms of entrepreneurship, we will always support the development, and there's a lot of investments coming into Africa. A lot of big international brands are seeing the Africa market as very important. So as you develop the international trade, we have to be compliant. We have to be also utilizing in our supply chain management. We use green strategies. So coming from a manufacturing and aviation background, in terms of fuel and energy, you'll find manufacturers are using solar, renewable energy. You'll find that a lot of the manufacturers, because of their emissions and to reduce their emissions, to increase oxygen into the atmosphere, they will grow millions of trees. So these are the projects that ESG frameworks in terms of ratings and metrics, which have to be shown progressively in the quarterly and yearly reports by private sector, is also aligning this to the African Continental Trade Agreement regime, which is aligning to the UN global goals to ensure that all the leadership meet these metrics. Thank you.
Thank you. And as you are speaking, I was just thinking, it makes obvious sense for Africa to trade more with its neighboring within its borders, and for neighbors to trade with each other, because even from an environmental perspective, you're reducing some of the carbon emissions just simply because you're reducing some of the supply chains and some of the transport issues. Wangui, we've heard from Jesse about the challenges that private sector are facing because of fragmentation of standards, and the fact that a lot of these standards are being pushed by the global north and are not necessarily appropriate for companies operating within an Africa context. Can you tell us more about the governance challenges and social impacts that this fragmentation causes us?
Thanks, Aisha, and thanks so far for some really interesting questions and sort of discussion points that are coming through. I think when we look at those three sort of framing ideas that are sort of expressed as the purpose of this webinar, so navigation, ESG, and trade, and then the continent. I think the word navigation is a key word. And that's because so much of what we're doing is needing to lean into the future and to start anticipating and creating systems that are responsive to what we need. So the current state of ESG frameworks is that over the last maybe decade and a half, close to 2 decades, in the context of the long-term climate governance and climate-focused efforts around shifting the conversations on global warming from being largely scientific, conversations that are viewed as technical discussions by experts that were disputing back and forth whether global warming existed, into a space where you're trying to create frameworks for accountability and for responsibility and stewardship of the planet. There have been several frameworks developed. Now, frameworks do 2 things. They give guidelines and they give principles with regard to what needs to be reported in order for you to know that you're speaking about the same thing when you're talking about an environmental impact or a social impact or governance obligation or impact. But they don't necessarily prescribe methodologies. So they don't say this is how you need to collect this type of information in order to report it, in order for us to know that this impact you're describing is in fact happening or possible. And historically, in the evolution of the frameworks, they were largely voluntary. So the UN Global Compact is a voluntary framework. The Sustainable Development Goals are slightly different because they're actually state obligations. They're treaty-driven and they're obligations of states. And so where we ended up is you then have these voluntary frameworks and these guidance sort of principles crystallizing into legislation. And that's what we're seeing in the EU and in other spaces, where these frameworks, these guidelines, these soft law instruments have now become hard law instruments that have tangible impact and obligations. Now, the major sort of inflection point that we're at right now, from a frameworks perspective, is that you have the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is an international accounting body that has now developed accounting standards that are going to start being implemented starting from about 2025, 2026 for companies that disclose financial statements to start reporting on 2 things: sustainability risks and opportunities affecting their businesses under S1, and then climate, physical and transition risks and scenario planning under S2. So what that means for African businesses, for African countries, is sooner rather than later, everyone will need to start, who's operating a business in Africa, who's looking for capital, who's trying to scale their business, who's trying to expand into new markets. Very soon they will start to have reporting on these types of requirements, and that means they need to start understanding themselves differently. Now, the challenge and the impact that I foresee with my little crystal ball, although it's quite obvious and I'm really borrowing from everything everyone else has said, is that there's going to be a radical need to upskill and to reskill. So this is no longer a tick box exercise. It's no longer a compliance checklist. It's no longer something, you ask the lawyer to just, review these 3 clauses and confirm they're fine. It really requires whole of system thinking at board level for companies, because their boards are going to be the ones that are having to assess climate, physical and transition risks. They're going to be the ones that are having to assess scenarios that could result if they pursue certain paths, etc. And then frankly for lawyers, right? And I think most of the people in the room, probably even on the call, are lawyers or law students. You need to study international trade if you haven't taken that course already. You need to study human rights if you haven't taken that course already. Your university needs to have a module on business and human rights, because it's no longer going to be that business and human rights is something that's looked at from the outside looking in, where NGOs or third parties are trying to hold people to account. It's actually going to be from the inside looking out, where businesses will have to start understanding human rights impacts of their activities. I'd say the second thing in terms of impacts and opportunities from a governance perspective is really both a political issue as well as an entity issue. So politically, one of the quite interesting things that perhaps young people on this continent don't quite understand is that by 2050, 1 out of every 5 people in the world who is of working age is going to be African. So just sit with that for a second, right? And 2050 is not far. I know that you're probably of an age where you think, that's going to be so far out. Trust me, it's sooner than you think. But that then means that there have to be policies, frameworks, incentives that work to promote the ability for businesses to grow, to scale, to create jobs. We need to have the right skill sets. And those are sort of political questions, right? Those are questions that require you to have a social imagination around what Kenya needs to look like, what Ghana needs to look like, what Nigeria needs to look like, what South Africa needs to look like in terms of an enabling environment. So in short, for lawyers and for people who are in business environments, I think you're going to have to be much more creative. You're going to have to really think about legislation and policy and regulation, not just as public participation exercises, but as things that shape the world you're living in and start being a bit more imaginative. And then I think in general for businesses, because of the accounting standards being standardized, some of the challenges Jesse was talking about in terms of why they need to look different for Africa need to be taken into account. And there are local standards, accounting standards bodies that are implementing them. So part of the policy engagement will be through business associations like the COMESA Business Council or CAM or KEPSA, talking to the accounting fraternity and starting to discuss what materiality should look like for an African business in a certain sector of a certain size, so that you can have a customized approach that enables funding, because funding now is so tied to climate and it's so tied to impacts, to start to flow to businesses so they can grow.
Gosh, I think we can end there, but we won't. We won't. And thank you for the speech. I think we can consider voting Wangui for president of the Africa of the future. But I'm going to come back to you in terms of carbon mechanisms, which is a little bit technical. So I'd like to turn to Adili. Adili, welcome. It's his first time in Nairobi. So welcome to Nairobi and Kenya. You can talk to us about your perspective from Southern Africa, where you're based. And I know that you primarily focus on work in the mining sector. So could you tell us about monitoring techniques that are currently being used for ESG? Because I know there's definitely, we've heard from Wangui, we have different approaches to methodology, but we also have a concern that some of the companies that are praising themselves in terms of ESG are actually greenwashing. So perhaps you can talk to us about some of the techniques and what you see as an expert in terms of where we should be moving in terms of monitoring.
Cool. Thanks, Aisha. Thanks for inviting me here with an esteemed panel. It's good to see some of you guys, and I'm liking Nairobi already. I'm going to speak a lot more maybe on the technical side at the beginning, especially when it comes to the ESG application in the mining industry, and particularly in the monitoring space. I mean, by training, I'm a scientist, but I'll try and not speak too much science. The one example that you guys can check is something called Brumadinho, the dam that collapsed in Brazil. Massive dam, a lot of people passed away, and the environment was really, there was a lot of other negative consequences to the environment. And so I'm speaking a lot more on the environment side from a scientific point of view. And that sparked some, like a reaction, not just from the local governance, it was actually from the investors to say, okay, we need to do something about this. How do we manage, for example, what's called tailings dam? So when people do extraction in the extractive industry, they mine and then they throw away the waste, but it's not like it's just a throwaway type of a thing. It gets stored in a big dam, and a lot of these dams were collapsing. So if a dam collapses, there's a neighborhood close by, it gets damaged completely. So they put together something called a global tailings storage management, GISTM, and that framework was basically to say all the mining companies in the world would follow a certain sort of called a policy, certain steps that should comply within the monitoring space. And most of them are doing it now, like the big companies, and they're doing it because it's driven by mostly the investors in the UK. I think it's the Church of England. But then when it comes to Africa particularly, you realize that even the companies operating for example, in Southern Africa, pretty much across the continent, you'd have the monitoring being coming from overseas, So that application is not really speaking to the local needs of the particular size in the countries. It speaks a lot more than by what the investors have said they want to do. And there is a lag between what the industry wants, especially because the mining industry is quite proactive in the space that allows the industry to not look bad. And the moment you have a lot of people dying, the industry looks bad. So what the industry does is to try to do everything for it to look.
Oh my gosh, sorry. That was an environmental impact. We have a gym upstairs, so it's people who are...
That's a good environmental impact. So there is a massive lag in the sense that almost all the monitoring technology is driven by the space that I work in. We use remote sensing technology. It's all entirely based from a satellite-based technology that just monitors any site anywhere in the world. We can visualize it, we can monitor it, we can report to the corporate office. The guys on site have no idea. So, and the local governance, there isn't a lot being done to really try and protect the environment locally, say within a country. There isn't anything being done to protect, to sort of, not just that, to align the global standards with the context of the country in which the company is operating at. So most of the companies, they're doing monitoring, which is good, but they're doing it because it's driven by the most of the northern countries and nothing being done by the local countries. And that's what I think what Jesse was saying, that in the mining sense, I think that's where we are happy, me saying we coming from Africa, that at least the global north has said something. Otherwise, people just be extracting and leaving. And our government are not doing much to put policy that protects the environment in that way.
Thank you. So I think you've already touched on some of the gaps we have, particularly in Africa, in the monitoring space. What can countries do, countries like Kenya well, maybe not Kenya, countries with limited digital capacity, how do we participate meaningfully in global ESG standards and standard making?
I think Kenya is not one of those countries. I'm going to speak a lot more with countries also with a lot of raw materials, which would be mineral deposits. And most of those countries really would be like the likes of Congo, Zambia, including South Africa to an extent. We have, when I say we, I'm including these countries as me being part of them. There's a lot of resources. I think there's a typical cliche saying that Congo is one of the richest country in the world, yet the poorest country in the world, because the local. So the first thing I would say is, I think I would probably end on the skills, which Wangui touched on. The first part I would say is that there needs to be an emphasis on, say, research and development. It needs to be something that is promoted within the country. And the classic example is that, like I said, the technology that we use is space-based, and all the space satellite images that we use or satellite data that we use, it comes from everywhere else but Africa, like literally from Asia, Europe, Americas, including South America, and nothing from Africa. So even though we can capacitate ourselves digitally, we don't have the infrastructure. The infrastructure in this case would be, we don't have any satellites. Is there an African, maybe something called European Space Agency, African Space Agency, with a few satellites of their own capturing data and being able to do that type of monitoring. So I'm speaking on an abstract example because that's this industry that I work with. But on an overall space, I would say we need to put up the infrastructure that will be able to support the skill set that we're building. And the second part for me is the skill set. And I think that's one of the rude awakening, especially for us young people in the room, that within 50 years, most of us will be alive. And either things will be the same as they are today, or maybe they would have changed either for the better or for the worse. So the point is, there needs to be an investment in skill. And I think I was speaking to someone who was saying on the flight here, there's always a problem of migration from Africa to Europe, but those are people who are not, I would say, economically good for those countries. People who are educated and skilled, it's easy to get a job, for example, in Europe. I work for European companies. But because there isn't much opportunities within Africa, and I don't think that we are doing a lot in terms of building this. We want to have the biggest human resource capital in the world in the next few years, in the near future. But are we going to be skilled enough, for example, to deal with the digital problems of the world? So when we move into, like I speak about the technology in the INSA space, you speak about the legal framework. Are we going to be capacitated to be able to deal with that? So the first thing I say, we need to build the infrastructure, and that really needs to be maybe biased. We need to have scientific resources that allows us to have the infrastructure that supports us as we, in the technology space, evolve. And also we need to capacitate ourselves. And the last thing is, we need not, I think there's one thing that we keep saying about the local partnership. I mean, I work a lot with different countries, including Kenya. And often when we try to get to do business there, they say, oh, you need a local partner. And this is a thing from Southern Africa right through to West Africa. And we need a local partner. Okay, the local partner becomes a tick box exercise. Okay, you need to tick this box, tick this box, tick this box. But there isn't an investment to say, okay, what type of technology do you work with? Capacitate our people, train 1 or 2 people within the country who, by the time you leave, will have an idea of how to use the technology you are using. That's much better than saying, okay, a local partner, tick box, then the company makes the money and the local partner makes the money, and that's it. There isn't a long-term goal of capacitating young people with skill set that will enable us to be able to compete in the global space. Yeah.
Thank you. Wangui, I'm coming back to you because I wanted you to talk to us about opportunities for Africa in accessing, opportunities in the space of EU carbon mechanisms. You know, what are the opportunities and what are some of the complexities, and how could these countries access those mechanisms?
Great, thanks, Aisha. And I really like Andile's points. I just have maybe one small quibble, if you want to call it that, with the word evolve. You said that, as we use technologies, we can then, how do we evolve our technologies? We're not really, I think evolution connotes a sort of, a starting point, amoeba to, and this is where I display my complete ignorance of evolution as a biological sort of process. But, you start from something very sort of undefined and blobby, and then it eventually becomes this great thing. I think we already have the seeds of greatness in us as African sort of actors, and that those seeds of greatness actually come from our own lived experience and our own sort of ability to see the world. I think what there is in a way a lack of confidence in our own ability to see things as they are, partly because the structures and the systems we're operating in are not responsive to us, right? So when we're talking about these ESG frameworks, for example, or the need to sort of evaluate whether this idea of auditing each other ad nauseum on a supply chain basis is actually a viable approach. We have our own approaches of doing business. We have had enterprise and business and trade and trust for a very long period of time, but those are not really given the credit they deserve. And so then we have this perception that perhaps we need to sort of take received wisdom and then apply it, as opposed to kind of find the received wisdom from our own kind of space and then actually give it back. So now, coming to the CBAM point, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, this is something that has been adopted in the EU starting last year, and it's a phased kind of approach towards climate change mitigation in the EU, right? So this point that we're talking about regarding the fact that the world is changing and that there are things that are happening outside of our immediate environments that are drastically affecting how we then operate, comes from the idea that climate change is a global problem. There's a climate change framework that all states have signed on to under the UN Framework of Convention for Climate Change. And within that convention, within the Paris Agreement and within its instruments, each state is or region of the world is making commitments about how to decarbonize in order to prevent global warming getting past the tipping point of 1.5 degrees, or staying within the range that keeps us below 1.5 degrees. So in the context of that principled commitment, you then have had in the last 20, 30 years, lots of steps being taken by different geographies regarding what they're going to do to mitigate carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas emissions. And in that context, the EU has a Green Deal, right, which has a target of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by, I think, 55% by 2030. 2030 is not far away. One of the ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Europe is to sort of incentivize trade in goods that have the cost of carbon attached to them, to make to spur businesses to adapt, and become more competitive by investing in decarbonization pathways. If you don't invest in a decarbonization pathway, you get taxed. Now, the supply chain context that we operate in is that Africa, by and large, supplies raw materials into Europe, which are then processed and then into goods that are sold back into Africa. And those raw materials that are being produced in African countries are produced in carbon-intensive sectors. So you have, cement, you have fertilizer, you have iron and steel, all sort of carbon-intensive industries which form the basis of most of Africa's exports into Europe, and those are going to be taxed under the CBAM framework, making them uncompetitive. And if you make them uncompetitive, it means they have nowhere to go. And in a way, what it does is it protects EU businesses in similar spaces, gives them time to, essentially closes the market to external actors, and enables EU businesses to kind of work out their transition and preserve their competitiveness. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism is really one of the things that needs to be navigated, because it's a change in operating conditions. It's a unilateral framework that the EU has adopted to meet its own needs, but has significant impacts on other countries in different parts of the world. And so there's been some pushback. So to answer your question, I wanted to set the context in case there's people who either were not familiar with or had not really heard much about CBAM. I don't presume that is the complete context. I encourage you to read about it and learn more. The main opportunity, because we're talking about opportunities right now, is tied to risk, right? So the significant opportunity is that you have hard to decarbonize sectors that use a lot of energy, that need to find places to operate that will make them competitive because they'll have a lower carbon footprint. Enter renewable energy. Africa has the most sort of renewable energy assets of any part of the world. And the costs of setting up and increasing value addition in African countries, so you can have some of the more carbon intensive activities happening here using renewable energy sources and then import them into the EU. There's a sort of hypothetical obvious advantage to doing that, but then we face the challenges that have already been described on the panel: the capacity, the technology transfer, the upskilling, and all those things mean Africa needs to be treated specially in the context of such a border adjustment mechanism, in order for there to be not just obligations to have low carbon intensity kind of products moving offshore, but also obligations to provide climate finance to African countries, right? Provide technology transfer to enable value addition to happen here, both in a domestic and a regional way. That's a real sort of opportunity. I'm sure you've seen economic partnership agreements from EU countries with different African countries right now. From a trade perspective, those things need to start getting built into those agreements. The other opportunity is, frankly, for African businesses to trade more within the continent, because you need to find new markets for your goods. And the AfCFTA, as Chris said, is really the platform that can do that. Now, the problem is, at day one, if in 2 years, as a major supplier of coffee or tea or some other raw material to a European business, you face the risk of having your business or your products rendered completely uncompetitive because of this tax. There's not enough time in those 2 years to have figured out your alternative markets and what to do. But there's an urgency now to negotiate better terms. And that's, back to the lawyers in the room. So there's been the South Africa, which is one of the biggest exporters into Europe from the continent, is, I think, pursuing a dispute at the World Trade Organization challenging CBAM and its implementation. There's a lot of discussion at AU level and at regional level, trying to generate common positions that enable specific affected industries or jurisdictions to negotiate a different pathway. And the opportunity for African businesses, frankly, is to get more involved in policy conversations. We don't just live and die by finance bills now. We live and die by other things that are happening at regional and international level. And as young bright sparks who are very close to public international law and other such subjects, you can start being conversation leaders in these spaces where some of the more gray-haired lawyers in the room have forgotten some of the basic principles we learned many years ago.
Thank you. I consider that Adili and Wangui have already given us their key messages. So before I open it up to the floor, I actually wanted to invite Jesse and then Chris to give us key messages, and then I'm going to take questions both from the online audience and the physical one. Thank you.
Thank you. First and foremost, I really sincerely thank the leaders joining us today and many leaders globally who are pushing a very strong agenda for private sector, public sector leadership and global leaders to come together. And my challenge is, Aisha doing a really wonderful leadership, is to involve more of the young leaders coming out of the universities and leaders in private sector organizations to participate and also to be great speakers. So we would like to see more younger people speaking at the UN leadership events, because your leadership voice needs to come out stronger, and you are the future. So my parting shot is very important. Our children's children, your children's children, must take care of the environment. We must together build strong leadership in private sector and government organizations, so that you are proud of the governance, the women leadership, and the opportunities that you're creating also for future generations. So Aisha, my parting shot is encourage, build for greatness, and Africa is the next great place to be. So I wish you all lots of success and keep up the great leadership. Thank you.
Thanks. I think what I'd say is kind of been reiterated before, but I think if you think about ESG, there's these brilliant principles that I think everyone agrees we should abide by in the type of world that we want to live into. But then ESG has also become a set of rules and dictates in terms of how they get implemented. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that ESG is not becoming a check-the-box exercise, that ESG is not just something that people want to do to feel good about themselves, because that will actually undermine and will be counterproductive to these wonderful, lofty principles of the world that we want to live in. And so I do think it's really incumbent upon you. I see a room full of young, bright people about continuing to think about how it's fit for purpose, how it's right-sized, and how it achieves its objectives, as opposed to checking a box on a piece of paper.
So moving away from tick box, Rutendo, do we have an online question that we can pose? Okay, so we have several. We'll take 2 online and then 2 from the physical audience, and then we'll see where we're doing per time.
Okay, so the first question has been directed to Adili and the panel in brackets. How can Africa take a more proactive role in shaping the global ESG framework, especially given its unique reliance on fossil fuels for development? Are we fully included, or how can we be fully included in discussions that consider our developmental needs and energy realities?
And then the next question is for Wangui. How can integrating ESG principles into policies help to tackle modern-day slavery in Africa? What successful strategies exist? And how can governments, businesses, and the civil society collaborate to enhance impact? Thank you.
So we'll start with Adili and then Wangui, and then we'll take some more questions.
Okay, I'll try to be short. How can we grow? Are we included? I don't think to a larger extent. And I guess let me start from this point. You know, climate change, we started realizing from a scientific point, the trends that the impact of climate change, or the impact of us as human beings on climate, really drastically changed from the early 1900s with the first industrial revolution. And over and over and over, it's gotten worse and worse. And literally, this is like a scientific fact. The global north has done most harm to the world. And now we all need to do something because the house is burning for all of us. But we still rely, South Africa is one of the classic examples, we rely on coal, for example. To do renewable energy, we're still trying to do it. You need a huge capex, which we don't have. We don't have those funds to do, but we can use coal. So we need to, I guess, participate in the table and really get the people who, I guess they say that there's more lawyers in the room. So if you guys, as you grow and become lawyers in the field, I think we need to find a better way of negotiating a deal that works for us. Because as I see it now, I don't think it does. We shouldn't be having, for example, power cuts in Africa, having coal in the Congo, having coal in South Africa. We also have renewable energy, not renewable, I would say maybe transitional energy, which is oil and gas. We have a lot of that. So I think that in the negotiating table, I wouldn't be able to know to what extent, but I don't think that as Africans, we, as a continent, we are participating and getting in these deals in our best interest, because surely there isn't much that we can show for it at the moment. And if things continue like this, there wouldn't be much to show for it in the near future.
Thanks. So the question on integrating ESG principles and policies into addressing modern-day slavery in Africa and the levels of collaboration is an interesting one. So I think I'd say two things. One is the International Labour Organization has a number of conventions that deal specifically with employment-related issues, including modern-day slavery, and most African countries are actually signatories to those. There have been steps that are being taken to domesticate some of those obligations through local employment laws and statutes and so on. And so I think one of the important ways of helping to ensure that that actually happens is by promoting legislative changes that essentially make laws more contemporary and more specific in addressing those types of issues. The challenge, I think, is because underemployment and lack of employment is a real issue on the continent. And so there are things that would apply in the context of modern slavery in a more developed economy that sometimes just locally, the reason you have a 10 or 12 or 14 or 15-year-old working is because if they don't work, they will not eat. So how do you then deal with some of those realities in this context? So in short, there's international frameworks that are being domesticated. I think there's an opportunity for, again, younger lawyers to, even in terms of your student associations in schools and what have you, start creating cross-cutting platforms where you can engage with NGOs, with private sector actors, with legislatures, with judiciary, sort of members of the judiciary, to start conversations that move the needle. But laws already exist. The question is enforcement, and then also localization, where because of social constraints, you would have a requirement for people who typically would be protected under those laws needing to actually be in employment in order to earn an income.
Thank you. Can I have 2 questions from the audience? Questions, not comments, please. Thank you. I think we have a lady here. Anybody on this side who might have a question? And a gentleman on that side. Can you pass the mic?
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be in such presence where I'm learning a lot, and especially from the South African point of view. Now, my question tackles what we call the corporate conscience, because I think when I talk about sustainable development, I think it borders more on conscience rather than even tangible laws. So my question would be, why are businesses afraid to do corporate social responsibility in terms of it moving from voluntary to binding, seeing that the different phases of CSR would touch legal, they would touch ethical, there is the economic bit, and then there is the philanthropic bit. So most corporates are shy because of the philanthropic bit, yet addressing it to Jesse, you have talked about the due diligence, the compliance. So they're looking to, I can say, tick the legal face of corporate social responsibility, but then ignoring the corporate conscience that would now result to sustainable development. So I would want to know what companies are feeling at the moment based on the economic growth concerning the binding nature of corporate social responsibility.
We have the second question and then we'll answer. So I think on that side, there's one question and then the panel can answer, and let us know who you think should be answering. One person though.
Thank you, Aisha. My question is it's a brief question. It's on sustainable financing. Probably Jesse would be best suited for this. So we've Wangui mentioned that we need incentivization, which can include having more climate financing opportunities in Africa. My question is, what are the incentives of pursuing a sustainable financing product rather than the conventional financing that we currently have? Yeah, because currently we don't have, ESG as it is, we don't have any legal or regulatory deterrence. We just have guidelines. So in my view, most of the promotion is based on incentives, This is the advantage I'm going to get if I go this route, rather. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the questions. I'll start with the second one. There are structures out there. I think it's still a bit nascent. We actually have a sustainable linked finance facility at MCOPA. It was actually the largest one that was put in place in 2023. And actually, if we hit certain targets related to green targets or digital inclusion targets, actually our borrowing costs come down. So actually our lending rates actually come down because the banks have agreed that, yes, there should be some advantage to that. It's not a huge amount, but it's there. I do think there needs to be more enabling environments. So there should be tax incentives. There should be other enablers that have investors wanting to invest in these types of projects, whether it's green bonds, whether it's sustainable linked financing. The mechanics are certainly there. I think carbon markets are another big one as well. I think obviously there's been a lot of turmoil, especially in the voluntary carbon market over the last 12 months. You just need to Google that to kind of understand what it is. Carbon markets, though, I still do think will play an important role in all of this. I think there's some teething issues that kind of need to be sorted there. But I do think there can and should be a better enabling environment to drive money into these sustainable programs. And we're an example of that. I think it could be better, though. Then in terms of the corporate conscious, look, it's a great question. I think, again, kind of back to my original point, I think when companies understand that it's in their business interest to have a corporate conscious, it's a much easier decision to make. And I think kind of marrying the two up, I think, are incredibly important. I think, there's competing fields of economics. One is that all economics should be driving shareholder value. And then there's the ESG, which is stakeholder capitalism. And I think there's definitely been a pendulum swing towards stakeholder capitalism, where people realize that bottom line is not the only thing that should be driving corporates. But I do think the pendulum has started to swing back the other way as well, because corporates are seeing that, again, as compliance costs, not fully understanding the reasons why they should be undertaking stakeholder capitalism. And so I do think it needs to be a marriage of government, of industry, of civic groups to kind of working together, because when they're not working together and it's a dictate or it's a mandate and businesses don't feel like they're fully bought into it, I think that's where you start to see some pushback. I think at MCOPA we're fully aligned with the fact that stakeholder capitalism and the broader good of the community is the broader good of MCOPA as well. But we're not fully there yet, I would say. I agree.
Sorry, Adili, you are agreeing with Jesse?
I am agreeing, but also want to add, I used to run a corporate social responsibility program in one of the companies I used to work with. And in South Africa, one of the driving factors was, because as a company, the incentive is bottom line, right? Especially if you have responsibility towards shareholders. But there was a legally, I wouldn't say binding, but an incentive from the government that says, if you do this, you get some points, and you would be favored, not favored, you'd be, you might pass through when, so for example, you apply for work with the government or with the larger entities, you might be able to get through some of the systems. So there's an incentive from the government, and the public sector says, incentivize you doing CSR work. And obviously companies want to do business, so they do a lot of CSR work for them to get the business. That's probably the best way to get it.
Thank you. Unfortunately we've run out of time, but I think we have all been left with probably more questions and answers, but also a lot of challenges even for ourselves in the audience about what is it. I think we're asking Jesse, corporates, Chris, Wangui, and Adili, what are the solutions, what are the opportunities? But I think we need to be asking ourselves as Africans, what is it we can do to make this better world and more realistic and achievable? I had a comment to make on the CSR point, and this is something that was explained to me by somebody who teaches, he's a professor of sustainability. What is the difference between CSR and ESG? Because these seem to be flavors of the month. You know, at a certain decade, we all used to hear about, oh, CSR. Now it's moving away to ESG. Is there really a difference? And the explanation which I sort of accepted is that the problem with the CSR model is that companies did not have to change the fundamental way they did their business. They could continue to essentially extract oil, ship it across the world, creating a lot of carbon emissions and make a lot of money. And then on the side, they would just have a CSR project that has no relationship to their operation. So all you have to do is say, I'm going to fund some ladies in a marketplace and I'll train them to weave baskets. And it has absolutely no link with your business operation. And that is CSR. Okay, but ESG is different. ESG is supposed to be looking internally, what Wangui said. It's a mindset shift. So you're looking internally, how do you operate? Where are your key customers? Who are your key suppliers? What are your key relationships? And how do you fundamentally transform those so that they're environmentally, socially, and meeting governance goals? And that is different because it doesn't allow you to take a random project in Ecuador and say that's okay and we can continue to make millions and billions from fossil fuels. You know, for me, I think that's an important difference, and we should be encouraging companies to stop telling us about their CSR, which is voluntary and has no relationship to what they do, and tell us a lot more about how they are changing the way they do their businesses. So that's my parting shot. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope this is the start of a very long conversation. I hope you'll be joining us for future sessions. And if you can give us feedback, please, even by email. If there are particular topics you think we should be raising as ALN Academy, as people in Africa, please do write to us. We always have to make sure it links with our strategic themes, but they are very broad, so they can always link. Thank you so much. Please give a hand to my panelists. And I believe we have some small gifts for our panelists, which Rutendo you will be able to hand out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aisha. Yes, you do. As our director making time. And thank you so much, Adili. Thank you, Wangui. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Jessie. And in the true spirit and fashion of webinars and such, we can do a photo op and all smile that we got bags. Yes, please, and you can just come to the front. Yes. Yes, right.
I feel that Wangui and I are being intimidated by tall men.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll now release our speakers, and yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You wanted to come and you did make it. Please, we've got some refreshments on the terrace for you all. Please enjoy and eat all of them, you know. Take them home. There is no shy, there's no embarrassment here. We have another webinar coming up on the relationship between public financing and security in East Africa and West Africa on the 20th of November.